I'd like to call to, thank you for joining us.
Let's hear to listen and learn. Thank you.
So I'd like to call to order the special joint meeting of Tuesday, April 6, 2021 between the South Burlington
This
Planning
conference will now be recorded.
and the South Burlington City Council. So the first item is the agenda. Are there any additions, deletions, or changes in order of the agenda? Okay, seeing none. We're now open to the public for items not related to the agenda. Are there any public members who would like to speak on some other issue? Seeing none. Announcements and staff report. Is there any staff want to make an announcement? Do any members have any announcements?
Thanks.
Okay, so then we'll move on to the meat of this meeting, and we're ahead of schedule. That's good. Presentation of the draft environmental protection standards with council questions and feedback. And I would like for the public to wait on their questions till the council has asked theirs, and then if there's we'll take questions or thoughts from the public. But this really is not a public meeting per se. I mean, it is public, but we're really looking for the two groups, the commission and the city council, to have an interaction about these standards, the work that they've done so far. So I will turn it over to, is it Jessica? Are you going to do the presentation, or is Paul, or?
I'm going to start out with the environmental protection piece here.
Okay.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and I'll get started. Although Helen did say that we won't be doing a lot of public comment throughout the discussion tonight, we have set a April 27th listening session as part of our Planning Commission meeting. We've set aside that entire meeting and are inviting the public to come discuss, and we will listen and answer questions related to this item, you know, because I know there's limited time this evening. And then beyond that, we will have our public comment period extend beyond that date, as well as formal public hearings as well. So there will be plenty of time for comment, you know, even if that winds up not being as part of tonight's meeting. So with the draft environmental protection standards, we have quite a few materials, as you saw in the packet. There are information available as part of the, on the city website. We have a specific project website with information, including links to map viewers. So the maps I'm going to be showing tonight, as well as an interactive map viewer where you'll be able to zoom into your individual addresses. On there, there's also a clean version of the draft regulations, as well as a red line version that was in the packet tonight. So we started this work actually way back in 2012, really wanting to better define our environmental protection standards so that they were more legally defensible. There was then a lot of work done in this area in 2014 and 15 as part of the Open Space Committee under the last round of IZ. And that report actually created some really nice maps showing an inventory of primary and secondary resource areas. In 2016, we put those maps into the comprehensive plan and used them as kind of a jumping off point for this current round of draft regulations, where we looked at all of those resources, evaluated them, and added quite a bit more to chapters 10 and 12, which is where the bulk of these changes are located in the environmental protection standards in the land development regulations. So a big piece of what we did was determine how to delineate those, and kind of a brief overview of some of the changes are that we also commissioned a study from scientists at Arrowwood Environmental to look at better defining habitat areas, habitat blocks, and habitat connectors, and how we could include those in our regulations. We then took that report and looked more closely and made a few modifications and set standards for how we were going to regulate those, including some allowances for changing some of the boundaries based on really specific criteria that we've laid out. We've categorized our environmental protections into 3 different categories. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here so we can look at the table. And this table is actually in the packet as well. So if you want to kind of follow along on paper or on your screen, you can also look at the table there as well, which may be potentially larger for you. So, okay, so first up on our table, and I'm not going to read all of this, but I wanted to just make sure that everyone had kind of seen this table and can refer back to it as well. So we have some of these resources are ones that we have or currently and in the past have already had protections for. So what this table is doing is really categorizing into hazards, the ones up on the screen are the hazards, which are areas where we really do not want to have development. Only very, very rare circumstances would be able to encroach into these areas, and they're typically areas where there could be actually a hazard, some kind of public danger or hazard associated with them, and they're often also regulated at the state and federal levels. Some changes in this category, we've made some updates to the 100-year floodplain to be more consistent with state guidelines. We've added the 500-year floodplain and have restrictions on that. We have consolidated the river corridor and stream buffer standards to streamline those, as well as make some changes so they cover a larger area. Our current regulations measure from the center line of the stream, and now we're measuring from the top of bank or top of slope. So it winds up being a wider area that we're now including in that regulation. With the Class 1 and Class 2 wetland buffers, we are proposing to expand the Class 2 wetland buffers to a wider area and areas outside of city center, and proposing to regulate very steep slopes. So then looking down into the other resources included in these changes, we now have something called a level 1 resource. So these include our habitat blocks and habitat connectors, which are newly proposed to be new areas for protection. The idea with a level 1 is that these are areas that are generally not supposed to be built on, with very limited circumstances where that some encroachments could be the case. And these are the ones that are based on the Arrowwood Environmental Protection, or the Arrowwood Environmental Report. Then we have the level 2 resources, including the 500-year floodplain outside of, in the developed areas, Class 3 wetlands, which we do already regulate, steep slopes, and some definition changes for the intermittent stream buffers. So I'm going to stop sharing this table right now, and actually I'm going to see if I can move into the maps. We have been working with, we've been working with the Regional Planning Commission, which has been extremely helpful to help us review, make sure we're consistent with state and federal standards, and to help with the language and boost our staff resources, which has been really helpful, especially since the Regional Planning Commission had helped us starting back in 2012. So I'm going to move into some mapping to show what this looks like kind of across the city in map view. So I know that these maps might be small on your screen, and it might take a second for them to come up. these are, this slideshow of maps is available on the project website through the city. And it is, you are able to zoom in and out to certain areas, and, you know, be able to take some time after tonight's meeting to really take a closer look at specific areas as well. So these resources are available on the city website. So I'm going to kind of use these maps to demonstrate some change in areas. These are things that we've been using in our evaluation. So I'm going to describe what we're seeing on the colors. So the orange yellow color is all of the areas that are our current environmental protection standard areas. So what's currently regulated in chapters 10 and 12. And then the green is our Southeast Quadrant natural resource protection areas. These are areas that have very little development allowed. And on most properties, there'd be no development allowed in them if there's an area of the property that's outside of the natural resource protection area. So we've included these in these maps as though they're protected areas. So moving to our next view, we've now added to that additional conserved lands. So this would include city parkland, privately conserved areas, areas conserved as part of a development plan. So this would be kind of our currently protected areas. So taking a look at what that looks like in combination with what we would consider our built areas. So the built areas would be considered the gray areas, and the property lines are shown with the very darker gray lines. And there's two different colors of gray here. You can see there's a few areas that have a light gray color. Those light gray colors are, you can see in the title, the approved or in review areas. So we wanted to kind of also include those areas that you might consider to be, I guess, in the pipeline for development. So
but they aren't necessarily permitted. They're just a possibility. Is that what you mean?
Yes, and Paul, jump in here if I'm misrepresenting that. I want to make sure I'm not speaking wrongly, but those are, yeah, the approved or in review.
That's correct, Jessica. And the light gray ones are ones where a preliminary plat has been submitted, so the application is vested in the current rules. The board has not issued a decision yet, so it's not necessarily approved, but it is under review.
Okay, so is there just one on the map? I can't really.
There's one large one and some smaller ones that don't really show up at this scale.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. So then jumping to a different view. So the blue areas here are our hazards level 1 and level 2 areas. And there's actually 3 levels of blue coloring. So the darkest blue, typically kind of in the center of these areas, are the hazards, whereas the lightest blue, you can see some of these kind of long lines here, are the level 2 resources. A lot of these kind of little fingers are some of those steep slopes that fall into that level 2 category. We're also showing this with the natural resource protection areas. So adding in the conserved and parkland areas. So this would be considered our proposed environmental protection areas. Overlaying that with our built/approved areas. Wait for that to come up. So the idea here being that the white areas are the areas that would not be constrained by the environmental protection standards and therefore would be generally available for development or other use. So starting to look at this together and what the changed area really looks like. The yellow-orange color, remember we had seen that on some of the earlier maps, that is our existing regulations, as well as the green. So the areas that you can see in blue are the areas that we are proposing for new regulation under our draft. We had requested from the Regional Planning Commission a mapping exercise to try to define the change in area. I'm happy to report I did get some numbers back from the Regional Planning Commission just this afternoon. So they are new and the commission hasn't seen them yet, but I'm gonna kind of read a few of them for reference. So the change between the orange existing and the proposed blue areas across the city is 974 acres. So that's the area you can see in blue. So looking at the percent of total area of the city, it goes from 17% covered by the environmental protection standards to 26% of the city covered by the protection standards. So you can see that that's that change.
Can you repeat that?
Yes,
Can
and
you
we'll be
repeat
able
those,
to
please?
send around the numbers as well. We had just received them just today, so we weren't able to post those yet. So it was 974 acres is the change.
In addition or subtraction?
It's an in addition, so 974 additional acres.
And you
And
talked
that's
about
what-
Is the blue.
26%.
Yes, a total of 26%.
And was there another figure you provided?
I said that the orange is 17% of the city.
The orange represents the originally, the current, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so the 17% was the current, the proposed is 26%. And I want to be clear, that's what we're looking at on this map, which is doesn't include the existing conserved and parkland areas. So I'm gonna add them onto this map. You can see these additional green blocks are gonna show up, which is our parkland, and other areas with different conservation aspects to them. So that would add to that as well. So, you know, we were just talking about what was covered in those environmental protection standards. When you start to look at this map, adding in some of that additional land, which has some level of protection on it, the mapping shows, that mapping exercise showed that we were up to about 42% of the full city land. 42% of the land area in the city would have some level of protection. And I know I might have used the word conservation, but you know, there's different levels of protection on these different lands, you know, whether they're city parkland or you know, a level 1 or level 2. So, and we'll have a full table, and you know, any mapping exercises is approximate. You know, I want to point out, like, some of these resources require an on-the-ground delineation, such as wetland delineation. So, you know, the mapping that we have is approximate on some of those resources. So there's a plus minus with those numbers.
And somewhere in all of this are the TDRs, but we don't really know where they are and how many there are.
I don't have those in front of me. The TDRs are associated with the green NRP areas that we were looking at and would be transferred onto areas where there would be development available. We have talked as a commission about allowing those, at least some of those, to be transferred to other areas of the city. And as you know, in our last round of land development regulation changes, we had included one way those TDRs could be used outside of the Southeast Quadrant.
Okay, thank you.
So this is kind of a last map here that's showing all of those different things layered on top of each other. So we have our gray built areas. green kind of NRP park and conservation and easement areas. So the areas that are kind of remaining for potential development would be generally the white areas on the map.
I think Michael had his hand up.
I'm going to suggest that it might be easier for everybody to see if you would point on that map which are the things we've added. You know, use your cursor, maybe say, unless they're mostly habitat blocks. But if there's anything else, good for the commission, for the council to know.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, Michael. So a lot of these are, and this might not be the best map to look at. I'm going to actually go back to this one. It's a little easier to see, maybe even one before that. So in general, the blue areas are the ones that we've added, and we've added them in a few different ways. A lot of the areas where there's a large kind of blob of blue, and you can see these in a few different places around the city. Those larger blobs are in most locations are habitat blocks. Habitat blocks are specifically areas where there's at least 20 acres of undeveloped area together, primarily forest, as well as adjacent scrub, transitional forest and wetland areas. So you also could see around most of these kind of long fingers of yellow. Those are typically our rivers and water resources. And you can often see kind of a blue area kind of peeking out around the yellow. You know, those are areas where our buffers around water resources have been expanded, or we're looking at areas where our wetland buffers have been expanded, where you can see that kind of blue ring around a yellow area. You can also see a lot of these kind of lighter blue areas that seem like they're hanging out in the middle of nowhere. Those are areas that are typically our steep slopes. So those are areas that do not really overlap with any of our previous protections that you see in yellow. And I think that is a lot of the areas. Some of the areas where the blue connects, this is actually a really good example here. This blue connection here and this blue connection here are an example of habitat block connectors. One thing that we did was we went through and looked at each of the habitat block areas and made sure that they were adequately connected to the adjacent or nearby habitat blocks, so that there was a path by which wildlife would be able to travel back and forth. In areas where that connection wasn't made, we did draw them in, and you'll see them on these maps.
And just a reminder, Jessica, that this is a live map, so you can zoom in anywhere, as can anybody else if they're using this.
Yes. Okay. Great point. So there is the habitat block connector that I was talking about. You can see that kind of medium blue line connecting across and down, and you can see you know, the expanded buffers around the water resources and wetlands through here as well. So, thank you, Paul.
Jessica, may I ask a question?
Yeah. Yes.
If you could zoom out, Jessica, just because I was looking at the bigger map when the question came to mind. Not that far.
Sorry.
Happy medium.
All right, hold on. Let me just recenter the map.
Sure.
It
All
goes,
right.
as you flip pages on it, it does go back to the whole city view.
All right. I think I can see it, and I can certainly zoom in on my own little screen here. And I believe it is around Spear Street and Swift Street. There's that skinny little yellow line that goes from the swamp area. Yes, that's, I'm assuming, some kind of brook.
It must be, it looks like a river, like some kind of stream, yes.
What is the width that represents that would be protected?
It should be 100 feet plus the width of the stream itself. So that would be 50 feet on both sides plus the width of the resource itself.
And does it, is that number based on what kind of land surrounds the stream, whether it be forest or grassland?
It
Or
is
is it
not.
just
It's all of the buffers are based on the type of resource. So in the case of wetlands, there's different width buffers based on the classification of wetland.
Thank you.
So it is independent of what type of development might be next to it or non-development open space.
Okay, we have a question in the chat box from Andrew Chelnick. It says the blue seems to be overlaying some of the green, the NRP. Can you show this so that it only shows blue where it's not green already? In other words, so that we can see only the additional protection?
So in this particular slideshow, I don't have a lot of control over that, but there is a separate interactive web page where you can individually turn on and off of each individual layer and see that better. So that is available on the city website. In this case, no. So it is a good point. So there are areas. So this is probably actually a good location. So here you can see the green NRP kind of is on both sides of this resource area. This is likely a habitat block area. Actually, no, that's probably a wetland. Here, let me zoom out. So this is actually a good example here. So we have a large green area, and the green does extend underneath these resources here. So the change between the yellow and the blue in this case is kind of not relevant because it was already green. It was already NRP. So there are some nuances of the mapping like that. So in this case here, it's maybe not considered newly protected.
And I would just add quickly to that that it is not a coincidence in that when the NRP was set up back in 2006, it was trying to capture the largest areas of natural resources. And so, you know, where Jessica just circled there, it's not surprising that that big wetland area, including some forested areas there, were put into the NRP because that's what the NRP was trying to do at a large scale.
And just to clarify the NRP, does that designation, what does that eliminate developing on those properties? I mean, is it as strong as the wetlands and the hazards? It's not, is it?
It's not as strong, but it is quite strong. So the rule is a parcel that was in existence as of 1992, if it's less than 15 acres, it can have one house placed on it. And if it's more than 15 acres in size, it can have 3 homes placed on it. If it's been subdivided since 1992, it is not allowed to have any additional homes. And so it's quite restrictive, and the green, the yellow and the blue add to it in terms of determining, in the rare instances where there is a little bit of potential for those 1 or those 3 homes, they cannot be in the red or the orange or the blue areas as proposed.
Can I ask a question following up on that, Helen?
Yeah.
So the way our LDRs are written regarding TDRs, for any new blue area that isn't necessarily in what was in the NRP or the green area, do those landowners now by default are they able to use TDRs, or might that I don't even know how many acres that is. It's hard to discern where the blue and green don't overlap. But do those landowners, Paul, have the ability to transfer the development rights of blue land that was not engulfed by the green land?
So I guess the answer to that will depend on the second part of this conversation about where you decide to go with planned unit developments. As written right now, if it were just adopted as presented, the any blue areas that are not also green areas would not be eligible for TDRs. However, as a planned unit development, the development could shift around on the property to a buildable portion of the property, just like elsewhere in the city. If there was today a wetland on the property, you can take the density from that wetland area and build the building elsewhere.
As a quick follow-up, that
Sure.
density would be confined to that one lot, though, not transferable across the SEQ to a different lot, right?
In that instance, yes.
Thank you.
Paul, this is Tim. For those individuals who have already surveyed land to create the TDRs but haven't sold them yet, would, in this current presentation, would those surveys then be moot and not be allowed to be TDRs?
Nothing in this draft changes anything about how the TDRs function. So there wouldn't be anything relegated to being moot here. The NRP district would be the same as it was previously.
Right.
And the Planning Commission draft at this point does not change which areas can be sending or receiving areas. So nothing becomes moot of a current action.
Okay, we have another question in the chat box from Roseanne. What about the connections? I think she means the habitat connections, but I'm not sure. I see an orange strip, but it seems to cross the newly approved Spear Meadows development. So would it be cut off?
So an orange strip for many years shouldn't have been cut off completely. I mean, Paul, is that something that you want to address?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that the orange strips or the blue strips are typically a stream, are a stream. And so something like, let's say, the Spear Meadows neighborhood would have required approval for getting a crossing of a stream and or a wetland. As proposed, the draft regulations would call that a restricted infrastructure encroachment, and the draft includes a higher bar for determining whether such a crossing is necessary and whether it's warranted. That there's a demonstration to the Development Review Board on 5 or 6 different criteria as to why that crossing needs to exist. So that's how something like that would exist in the future.
And what is that called again? A restricted
Infrastructure encroachment. So it is largely the only significant exception to these rules, and it's only granted in the instance that there's no alternative to get to a significant amount of land that is otherwise unrestricted from development.
And what's the definition of significant, or is that a DRB determination?
There's a number of criteria. They would have to demonstrate that there is no feasible alternative to get to that land. They would have to demonstrate that they have communicated with any adjacent property owners that might be able to provide access without crossing it, and that has been refused. They would need to demonstrate that there's an economic hardship created by it. They would need to demonstrate that at least 30% of the developable portion of the property is on the other side of that, so you couldn't cross it just to build one house. And I believe that there's one more criteria, but it's all of the above there.
So you have to meet all of them. Okay.
Correct. And then if that is all met, then each individual resource has its own standards associated with it, such as if it's a wetland crossing, It would need to be the narrowest road available. It would need to have, if it was a stream crossing, it would need to have animal, the culvert would need to be sufficiently sized to allow for small animal crossing underneath it, etc.
Okay, so I do have another set of maps. I don't know if you'd want me to move through with those, or if it looks like maybe there's some questions.
Yeah, it looks like, I can't see, Michael.
Yes, I had a question going back to the data that Jessica mentioned, which she only got today, I think she said. Now, the blue areas include certain areas which are already protected in some sense, like the Wheeler Park is shown as blue, Red Rocks Park is shown as blue, the University of Vermont properties at Edland and so on are shown as blue. Were those part of the 900 acres that whoever gave you the data calculated, and the percentage? Because there's quite a few that would have an impact on that total amount of land that we were talking about earlier.
A great question, Michael, and I'll take this one just because Jessica only saw it about an hour ago. So we calculated it both ways, Michael. So there is a calculation of the total area of land covered by the proposed Articles 10 and 12, the hazards, the level 1s, the level 2s, and there's a calculation of the total area of land covered by the proposed Articles 10 and 12 outside of what is considered conserved areas. So that would be the parks, the Natural Resource Protection District, the third-party conservation areas, and the private association land. So the second category of areas outside of what is considered to be conserved is that 974 acres. If you take out all of those areas and you just say how much land is covered by Article 10 and 12 period, it's 1,708 acres.
Okay. Colin, do you want
Okay,
me to
so
Mhm.
the Great Swamp is shown as
Hold
blue.
on. I'm sorry.
Which category would that be in?
Hold, Michael, that doesn't make sense, Paul. I'm sorry. 1,708 acres. So if you were to take out the conserved areas, because if we move from 17%, which you're
Right,
saying fits into that 1,708 acres, and go to 26%, which is 9% more.
Right. Now,
That does not.
let me try to say that again. So I'm not comparing proposed regulations to future regulations in the two numbers I gave there. So the two numbers I gave were if you didn't consider anything that is conserved by it's in the NRP, it's a park, etc., and you just said how much land in South Burlington is subject to a hazard level 1 or level 2 resource. The things that Jessica went through, that would be a net change from the old rule to the new rules of 1,700 acres and a total of 4,449 acres of land total.
That
makes
sounds
sense?
closer to the 9% increase.
Right, so that represents that 4,449 acres is the total land covered by Articles 10 and 12. And that's 42% of the city. Of that, a portion is already protected in some manner by being conserved land. And so that's why we take that 4,449 acres and it becomes 2,740 acres, or a net of 974. So that's it. I know it's hard to sort of take these numbers in the air, but we tried to run it both ways.
Okay, I have to just say, Jessica's initial presentation was a lot clearer to me. So I just want to just say
I
that
understand.
I understand that some people might understand more clearly what you're saying, but I'm going to go with Jessica. Sorry, Paul.
No, that's fine. I was just trying to answer Michael's question of what's included and excluded.
Can I just say these numbers will come out like in a follow-up for us to all look at because nobody's seen it in writing yet, right? So some kind of breakdown is something that we'll all get to see as an addendum to this.
Yes, yes. And, you know, I just know it was something that the planning commissioners had requested these numbers. So since I did get them today, I wanted to, you know, give some of what we received ahead of a later thing. Okay, so Helen, unless you think otherwise, I'm going to move into how this relates to the comprehensive plan.
Sure, unless
Okay.
anyone has other questions. Seeing none. Okay. Yeah,
And
that
we're
sounds good.
still on the same topic, but just kind of
Right,
related
right.
to the comprehensive plan. So one of our legal tests with any change in land development regulations is to see how our proposed changes relate to the comprehensive plan, and it is a big focus of the report that goes out with any change prior to a public hearing. So you do see a draft of that report in your packet, and we have some mapping to go along with that. So up on the screen, this map is intentionally fuzzy. This is the comprehensive plan future land use map. This map was adopted as part of the land development, or as part of the comprehensive plan in 2016. We did do significant public outreach with this map at that time, and the different colors mean some different things. I know the legend is a little fuzzy up there, but the green generally means that we are planning for very low intensity and principally open space. So areas that would stay green. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the red areas indicate a medium to higher intensity area, typically use. Similarly, the blue areas would also be medium to higher intensity, principally non-residential. So this might be industrial or commercial areas as well. And then the orange is medium intensity, principally medium intensity, and yellow is a lower intensity, principally residential. So in general, this was in the comprehensive plan, and what we we'll be looking at here in these next couple of maps in relationship to our proposed regulations. So first, I put on the green areas here are the same kind of conserved areas that we were looking at on the last map. So this would include city parks, privately conserved areas, and then we can add into that in the lighter green, the Southeast Quadrant natural resource protection zoning as well. And this is adding in, and you can actually see some of the legends. You know, we have in our darkest green, we have hazards. And in fact, that is very confusing to have this legend up with only some things open. So I'm actually going to close the legend. So you can see the whole map there. So we've added in green our proposed environmental protection standards. So on our last set of maps, these were the blue areas. And I do apologize for changing the color, but we wanted to be consistent with the comprehensive plan coloring. So these would fall into that kind of principally open space category of green on this map.
That's the deep green?
Yes. Yes.
And
sorry.
underneath a lot of it is the light green? Yeah, okay. So you can't really
And
see
then-
it.
Yes, and you know, you can see a few areas here, you know, that have that fuzzy, very light green underneath. Those are areas that the future land use map and the comp plan does show green, but we don't have that darker green over them. Those are generally lands owned by UVM, such as the Hort Farm and the Wheelock Farm. So to reset this map to look again, so just back to our base comprehensive plan map. we're going to add in our built areas. So these are the same gray built areas that we were looking at on the previous mapping slides. So you can kind of see where those came in. Then all of those things together. So we have our gray built areas, our green parkland, conserved lands, NRP, and proposed environmental protection standards. And we then have some other colors showing. Like we were saying, there's a few areas of green over in this area, typically the UVM lands. And then we have other colors that are showing through. We have some yellows, some reds in the village commercial Southeast Quadrant. We have some red up in the city center area, some blue around in Meadowland, and some. So basically anywhere we're seeing these other colors shining through there, those are the areas that the comprehensive plan would show those other types of uses kind of proposed. And,
say that again. It would show what other uses?
So generally, like if this is shown as yellow, generally the comprehensive plan would indicate that that would be a lower intensity, primarily residential land use that would be affected there in the future by the community, or over in this area we have some orange, red. That would be kind of where we have designated the village commercial area, where you might start to see some medium to higher intensity mixed use area kind of in this area. Or, you have a property here that has kind of a variation of colors through there. So some non-residential, some medium intensity, some lower intensity. So I think that's generally what the comprehensive plan is showing kind of in those areas that aren't covered by the green or the gray.
And again, just clarification, and I'm sorry, I might have cut Michael off earlier, and I apologize, Michael, if that's the case. Is the blue lower intensity development?
So the blue is medium to higher intensity, but it's different from the red because the red would indicate more mixed use with residential, and the blue indicates principally non-residential. So the blue would be commercial or industrial, kind of a principally non-residential.
And that's the two parks, the two development parks.
Like
Meadowlands and Technology, right?
Yeah, Meadowlands and Technology is generally what those are on here.
And then a little bit on the Hill Farm.
A little bit on the Hill Farm. You can see the red with the higher intensity mixed use for City Center. In here.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So this is great. I love this color coding, and thinking about the recent conversations about Burton right on the border of South Burlington with Red Rocks. I'm curious, does such a map exist where we incorporate Shelburne's and Heinsberg's and Williston's color coding along the boundaries? I just would love to know if there's a major contrast and how we fit with our neighboring communities.
That's a great question, Tom. I have not seen one, but it does remind me of something that I did not say in the earlier. You can actually see a few locations where we show some green areas extending beyond our city borders. Those are areas that are habitat blocks that we are not regulating. We are obviously not regulating over in Williston or outside of our borders, but we are showing them on our maps here because it was important to the size of and the definition of a habitat block to have that mass of forested area. So the animals using that habitat would be able to move back and forth across the border area. So it is on our map for kind of context, even though we're not regulating those. And Paul, I don't know if you know of a kind of bigger regional map other than the ECOS map. I don't know if that's something to reference.
There is the ECOS plan is the regional plans, that is the regional plan. They have a compilation map that breaks, they have about 4 or 5 total different land use categories, generally rural, what they call enterprise, which is our business, village, residential, I believe, and downtowns. And it's a compilation of all of the future land use maps essentially brought together. I can link this in the chat for everyone to see if you'd like.
Okay. Yes, Monica.
Yeah, I was just going to say this was a very helpful visual for me when we were looking at all of this, that when we get to the point in our agenda where we're kind of having the big picture conversation, this image may be a good one to call up again. So just put a little sticky there.
Yeah, I agree, Monica. I think that getting to that point in the agenda where we're having kind of a bigger picture conversation is important, and I agree with bringing this map back up. I do have two more maps that I'd like to show as well. It looks like.
May I ask a question too? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
May I ask a question with this, Jessica? Because I'm seeing the blue off of Kimball there in the technology park, and the blue off of Heinsberg Road, east of Heinsberg Road in our business park. And I'm really curious why housing isn't allowed and intermixed with those businesses and industries that are there already.
Yeah, it's a good question, Megan. One thing that we've talked about in the past when discussing these areas is, although mixed use is really wonderful and we're very excited about mixed use, it's important to reserve areas that are available for the types of land uses that aren't compatible with people. We do have certain businesses that might make some noise or might have unsightly storage outside, or I don't know. I mean, Paul can probably articulate this better, but if you all of a sudden build a lot of houses next to a warehouse or industrial or manufacturing location, those people might not appreciate the noise or the hours of use. So that is actually one of the reasons why we've continued to have some areas that are specific to that industrial type of use. And Paul, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I would just add to it, Megan, that I think that there's an evolving the nature of business parks are evolving, and I think it's something that's on the commission's work plan to be analyzing and reviewing which kinds of business park things are compatible, like office buildings that we're seeing in parts of Technology Park, and which types of businesses and where do we want to save space for the kinds of things that Jessica was just describing. So an example would be the FedEx building that is going up right now that will be having trucks at many hours. And, without going too much into this subject, one of the subjects for discussion of the commission is how much land should be reserved for those things that are really incompatible, not just for today, but for the next significant user 10 years from now, 30 years from now, that really would only be able to locate if it were not near housing.
Okay, I just wanted to note a comment in the chat from Sarah Dopp. The Champlain Valley Conservation Partners Group is working on mapping, Tom, with adjoining communities to identify sensitive conservation areas on the overlapping borders. And CCRPC is working with them. So potentially that is being addressed in some manner.
Can I just say on the blue as well, to Megan's question, that having a place where South Burlington can attract jobs is very important. And that's part of what that blue is as well, jobs.
Okay, so I do have 2 more maps that I think would be helpful to show before we get into the next agenda items. And maybe we could save a lot of the discussion related to them for our kind of bigger picture discussion. Let's see. So the other 2 are also comprehensive plan maps. So we have in the comprehensive plan map 7, which is the primary conservation areas. And I know this is also a little fuzzy with the legend. We have a few different things shown on here. And then just for reference, I'm going to add in our green areas that we were just discussing on top. There's a few things that are kind of peeking out from behind. We have some purple blob areas. Those purple blob areas are rare species, an area where a rare species was found. Our draft does include an evaluation of rare species in the case that there's any intrusions into the habitat block areas, as well as we've asked the Natural Resources Committee to see if they can think of some other ways that we might incorporate those into the maps. They are regulated at the state level and would be regulated on any properties that go under the Act 250 review. Other that we're seeing some of these isolated areas, you can see some little kind of blue areas hanging out in the middle of nowhere. Those are really just some differences in mapping, such as our steep slopes. And then there's some areas where there's some blue crosshatch, which on the background map is called riparian connectivity. As part of our work, we have kind of moved away from this kind of state level, course level mapping of riparian connectivity to delve into specific areas where we are protecting areas, which is the riparian corridors, which is areas immediately adjacent to water resources, as well as did the city-specific study on habitat and habitat connectors to get at that connectivity piece as well. So I think although it's not the exact same mapping, we've kind of looked at the goals and have some different kind of definitions of those resources and how they're delineated to get to that riparian and habitat connectivity piece. So then looking into the secondary conservation area map from the comprehensive plan, this has multiple forest areas. Actually, I'm just going to skip ahead to this next map here. And I know there's a lot on here. We have a few areas where there's not a lot of kind of exact matching of resources on here, but quite a bit of overlap. There were a few of the resources that show up on the secondary resource map here that we had quite a bit of discussion about how or if to incorporate into the chapter 10 and 12, and have not included them at this point for the public comment draft. Those would be the primary agriculture soils, grassland and shrublands and farmlands. So there's a few areas where you can see where those are not covered by the green. And, you know, I think that that is one of the things that would be good to think about in our kind of bigger picture discussion, which is the agenda item 6, kind of what we want to see. I think one of the things that we were struggling with is, you know, if we put protections in all the areas shown in dark green, and then we also put additional protections on kind of all these additional resources and goals, you know, are we meeting kind of our balancing goals with regards to housing and, you know, other city goals. So, you know, I think that that's a kind of bigger picture question for as we get into that next agenda item. And I think the other piece that I wanted to point out, and I might unshare my screen because I think we're going to start to transition into the next agenda item, but just one other follow-up piece. So Chapter 9, we do have a change to the Chapter 9, which refers to the Southeast Quadrant zoning district that I wanted to call attention to. When it was written, it referred to a map that showed a few conservation areas, including the Great Swamp. When we redid the comprehensive plan in 2016, we changed maps to kind of replace that map of the Southeast Quadrant conservation areas with maps 7 and 8, the two we just looked at. And it was kind of brought to our attention relatively recently that in the Southeast Quadrant zoning district, we referred back to those comprehensive plan maps, 7 and 8, the ones we just looked at. This also came up recently in some of the DRB hearings. And I think one thing that we have in our draft right now is we've removed the reference to maps 7 and 8 and are referring specifically to the resources that were regulating in chapters 10 and 12, so that there's no longer a kind of legal confusion as to how to define resources, what those resources are, what an encroachment may or may not be allowed to do. So there's no longer kind of confusion in how the interpretation of those maps may be, you know, in front of the DRB. So I know that most of our changes are specifically in chapters 10 and 12, but there are some kind of related references to resources in other chapters that we have some changes to as well, including definitions in chapter 2. And you can see all of that in the draft in the packet.
Jessica, Matt Coda has a question or a comment. I don't know which.
Sure.
Both that's okay. Excellent presentation. And I know there's more to come. I think that change in Article 9 is critically important, and I'm glad it's there. The question that I had is regarding habitat blocks and habitat connectors. We're referring to the new city natural resources map, but it's still a fuzzy line, of course. So is there a field delineation or some way that we can look at the map and then get on the ground and determine where that habitat blocks or habitat connector begins and when it ends, and what resources do individuals have? They either own the land or live near the land or interested party to determine where that fuzzy line starts and where it ends.
So it's a good question. So the edge of a habitat block is not fuzzy. It's a solid line on a city-owned map, and we have GIS that would be available to a property owner to overlay on their own site plans. And then because that line was delineated based on remote sensing, we felt like it was important to provide a landowner with some ability to be able to make some modifications to that land. So we have a list of 5 different options in the draft that are very specific to how that line could be adjusted potentially on a particular property without compromise to the habitat block as a whole. So one example may be that there's actually not very much forest in one area, but there is more forest in a different area on the same property. So they could potentially kind of change the line to carve out that area with the small trees and include the area with the large trees. You know, that's an option. So there's specific criteria on how that would work. Larger changes would require an analysis by a biologist to actually kind of weigh in on the changes. So habitat connectors are a little different in that we wanted the point A to point B to stay the same and the width to stay the same, but there is the possibility to shift the location from where it is on the map. And Paul, do you want to, I may have missed.
No, you didn't misspeak. I just wanted to add one note to everything that Jessica just said, which is that a field delineation in some areas of science are very well established across the country. So a wetland field delineation, wetland scientists, there's very good, 50 years of history and litigation to determine where that line is. And so there's really not a lot of debate on where that line is. The habitat blocks, forested areas are a newer area in regulation. And so what this draft tries to do is create certainty so that there aren't battling ecologists that go all the way up to the Supreme Court for projects, and at the same time give a little bit of flexibility. And those are those options that Jessica was describing at an applicant's discretion to say, my layout would be a little bit better if I did this, but not sort of push things into what would likely be a contentious back and forth between competing scientists. So that's why that is done in that proposed way.
Good, thank you.
Okay, Megan.
Sorry, Jessica, I'm just trying to digest all of this. What does Chapter 9 specifically address? And I was looking for the LDRs on my computer and couldn't find them. Sorry.
So Chapter 9 is the Southeast Quadrant zoning district. So one of the things that we really set out to do was to consolidate all of the environmental protection standards into the kind of well-defined new chapters 10 and 12. So there's, other locations in our regulations where we also referred to different standards. So we're really trying to streamline, and maybe streamline is not the best word, but not refer to a fuzzy map in a different document. It just.
So what does Chapter 9 cover then with regard to the SEQ zoning district? As it remains now, as it's proposed to.
It refers to, and maybe Paul Connor wants to weigh in, but.
Article 9, Megan, is written a little bit differently than the other ones. It's sort of currently, it's a self-contained chapter for the most part. And so it has its own road standards, it has its own building standards, it has its own layout of lots, park spaces, all those things. The change in this amendment would only be as it relates to natural resource open spaces, to referring to the new Article 10 and 12. The rest of all the things in the Southeast Quadrant, TDRs, amount of development, all of that is untouched by this draft.
Thank you. Crystal clear. Thank you, Paul.
Can I make one reminder or just background comment? If you go to the LDRs right now and you look at Article 12, it's actually called Surface Water Protection Standards. So just as whereas Chapter 9 or Article 9 kind of did refer to more than just water protections, because that was the goal for that area. And basically everything that we have done is said, well, we're going to add to 12 to not just be about surface waters anymore. And that's why it can more consistently cover everything in the LDRs and be more consistent.
So Helen, I know we have a hard stop. I think it's 7. I know, and I guess I think that there is definitely room for more discussion specifically of the environmental protection standards. And I do want to get to the bigger question of, what the shape of development looks like in the areas that are not covered by, these green areas, the areas we were just looking at on the map. So, Paul is going to cover kind of a quick overview of the PUD work that we've been working on to give you an idea of what other things we're considering for those other areas. And I think, it's a good place for us to be able to step back kind of as both groups and just try to think about, did we hit the mark with what we have? And in the environmental protection standards, are we achieving all the city's goals? Does it look like neighborhoods make sense to be in the areas that weren't covered by these environmental protection standards, or do we have more work to do on resources? So You know, I want to make sure we leave room for that discussion as well as Paul's presentation, which I think is next on the agenda. So,
Okay. I have one question from Tim Barrett. Are there any restrictions today on landowners to prevent them from logging a forest block?
The answer to that, Tim, is no. So long as they meet the water quality requirements at the state level, forestry operations, just like agriculture, are exempt from local regulation in Vermont. However, it does need to remain an active forestry. So if somebody were to remove trees, for instance, what is left has to be the regrowth of the next generation of trees. It can't just be turned to lawn. That would not be considered to be a ongoing forestry operation as far as the state's concerned.
What if it wasn't a managed forest area, defined by being in current use, right? What if it was just their private land, but it happens to be in one of the forest blocks? Is there anything to prevent a landowner from cutting down all the trees in their forest block? I'm just curious if there are any restrictions today.
There, again, an operation like that would be exempt from local regulation because it is considered forestry, whether it's a small patch that is privately owned or it's something in current use. What the state would be looking at carefully is, A, is it an ongoing forestry operation? As I said, just converting it to lawn afterwards would not meet their definition. And B, they would be looking closely to make sure that the sort of staging area is appropriately scaled. So, if you have a 200-acre woodlot and you've got 1 acre of that you've cut it down to be a staging area and parking, that's fine. But if you had a 4-acre parcel and you said, oh, I'm going to make 3 of those acres my staging area, that wouldn't meet the state definition of forestry.
Okay, Monica?
I just to clarify that though, because I had similar questions, Tim, before, and to be clear, once the habitat block and connectors are adopted, however, that's there. So even if somebody did opt to then get into forestry, it doesn't change where the line of the habitat blocks is as in the LDRs. That stays.
Okay. So are we going to move on to the next topic?
sure. So the next topic is an overview of the planned unit developments. I did ask Paul Connor to kind of lead that discussion. He has some images to show from our past couple meetings. Is he still? Did we lose Paul?
Still here, just loading it up.
Oh, okay. I was like, oh no.
Oh, we would find plenty to talk about.
Yes, we do have lots to talk about. I just didn't have the imagery ready. So,
Oops.
and Paul, we are seeing your email. Looks like.
Yeah, no, I know. Multiple screens. Hang on 1 second. Okay.
Well, this looks familiar. You sort of went
right.
through this a long time ago.
Yep. So just for some reason I can't get rid of the band, but I think you can see it. So this was a slide that you had seen last year. This is just sort of the breakdown reminder of a hazard, a level 1, level 2 resource, and then the white is the remainder. That's the area that could be a subdivision or a planned unit development in the future. So I'm just going to very briefly sort of talk about the major qualities of what makes a traditional neighborhood a TND and a conservation PUD. And really, this is partly an update to show where the commission's at, but it's also partly to sort of think about the character of how you all might want to see land that is developable in the future, how you'd like to see it built. So traditional neighborhood, the idea of this is that it's principally residential. It's fairly compact. The first thing that you will have done is, using that anatomy of a parcel, you've removed anything that is a hazard or level 1 resource. And in the Southeast Quadrant, you've also taken out anything that happens to be in the NRP. So this is only about the buildable portion. So from that buildable portion, And for some reason, my little percentage numbers are not correct in there, but the chart is correct. It's largely residential. It should be saying 65% residential minimum, 15% civic space minimum. So that's 80% of your property. Civic space is active usable land for parks or things like that. 5% mixed use. Mixed use could be something non-residential if allowed. It could be a community building. And then the remainder is called unallocated. Unallocated could be resources. So you might have, you might choose to have a orchard in the middle of your property. It may be that the shape of your neighborhood has some class 3 wetlands in it, and it's just, you know, it's easier to put it into your neighborhood, but then protect them. It could be additions to any of the above, or in some cases, it might be something like a stormwater pond. It's something that doesn't fall easily into a category. Michael, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear. You said 80% or percentage is a percentage of the buildable area.
Correct. It is the buildable area. Whenever I'm talking about percentages here, it's only of the buildable area.
Because you said of your property, which would might confuse.
All right, thank you. So here's a little chart that our consultant put together that was just sort of walking a property through how they would run this mass. So they started with 16 acres. There were wetlands and a habitat connector on the property. There would be roads and rights of way, and what they wind up with is about that equals 7 acres, and what you wind up with is a developable portion of 9 acres, 9.1 acres. Of that, and this is to the point that Michael was just raising, a portion would be residential, a portion would be open or civic space, and then a developer would then figure out how to place the land on there, place the development on there. So in this case, they're doing a mix, and I'll talk about that in a minute, of some single families, multifamilies, cottage court, and a duplex. The target density described in there, that's the developer's target. This is our consultant trying to put their hat on of, I'm a developer, and I'm going to try to build something at this scale. We'll talk about density in just a minute. So here's a sample of what a traditional neighborhood could look like. This is just sort of allocating space by the categories. The green is the civic space, the yellow is the single family homes, and the other colors become different forms of multifamily, duplexes, etc. And then I'm just going to slide forward to, this is a sample of how something like this could be laid out. So, you know, here is the output of a traditional neighborhood with a mix of single families, 2 families, cottages. Some of them have garages facing off the back because they're very narrow lots. Some of them are a little bit wider, and so they've got a garage that they're able to just have a driveway off the street. And a big part of this, you'll see in the top right-hand corner, you see that there's a habitat connector, so that's been left out entirely. And in the middle of it is this civic space, and that's really intentional to be sort of a focal point of the neighborhood, to really think about making neighborhoods not just places where houses exist, but places where people know each other as neighborhoods. And there's a bunch more features of this. This is a highly condensed version of a longer presentation that the commission got, talking about the sort of whys and wheres, but this is sort of the scale that a traditional neighborhood could have. Quickly here, some key features. As I mentioned, hazards and level 1 resources are excluded. There are land allocations, as we just talked about. Density. Density in a traditional neighborhood as proposed is an output of the layout. And what I mean by that is there are specific standards laid out in the draft regulations that would determine the minimum and maximum block size, the minimum and maximum street length, the relative sort of design of lots that they need to be deeper than they are wide, for instance. There would be a series of specifically allowed building types, and building types would have characteristics to them. So single family homes, duplexes, small multifamily buildings that look like single families, townhomes, that kind of thing. Each of them individually would have their own lot dimensions with them. And this is something that the commission spent some time on looking last fall about the challenge that exists today with using density as just a numerical number for designing neighborhoods, because what happens is that if somebody puts, say, 4 single family homes on an acre, 4 units an acre, and they lay them all out, then what you get is sort of the spacing of 4 single family homes. But if you took that same 4 units and you made it one small fourplex, like the fourplex that's going in the Habitat for Humanity is building on Heinsberg Road, for instance, you wind up with a big giant green area around it because the numerical density is still only 4 units an acre. And so you get things that wind up being very out of character for what's around them. And it's sort of a specific, for instance, of that is when the Kirby cottages went in on Kirby Road, there's 7 of them, and they're single family homes, which are sort of scaled of what's around them. After they got their approval, the developer came to us and said, hey, just FYI for your regulations, at the time that could have been 1 sixplex that was just sort of taking up all that land or positioned sort of plopped in the middle of the land with a bunch of green area around it, but having no sense of scale of the neighborhood. And that's what this is trying to address, of making sure that neighborhoods are enjoyable, walkable environments where it's not just about housing. I want to speak briefly about both minimum and maximum density. So maximum density would be determined by the allowed mix of housing that is put on the property. So you might say that you're allowed to have single families, 2 families, and small multiplexes. Each of them have their own lot sizes that are associated with them, and each have certain characteristics of where they need to be located. That the mix of what is put in there and the minimums and maximums that the Planning Commission and the council would establish of, you could be no more than, say, no less than 40% single family homes, let's say, just making a number up. That would determine the actual numerical density rather than the number being the starting point. The only exception to that would be minimum density. And the idea of a minimum density would be that for a traditional neighborhood to function as an actual traditional neighborhood, it needs to have some base of the amount of housing. Otherwise, there's nothing wrong with a different form of development, but for it to be a traditional neighborhood, to have the characteristics that we talked about of having a central park, having the infrastructure there, it needs a certain amount of housing to create the scale. Importantly, for both the developer and the city long-term, it needs to have an appropriate ratio of infrastructure to amount of development so that the developer can afford it up front, and long-term, very importantly for the city, that we don't have these be net losses as we have to maintain these roads forever into the future. And then lastly, a minimum density sets some certainty for everybody. It creates greater clarity for everyone at the beginning of development review process as to what to expect for a neighborhood. I'm going to very briefly speak about conservation PUDs and then move into your larger discussion. A conservation PUD, here's a schematic image of it. The idea of a conservation PUD is that you're prioritizing the conservation of land. So 70% of a parcel in this as a minimum would be for conservation purposes, and the remainder of that land would be for a neighborhood. And the idea generally is that if you were to compare a conservation PUD to a typical standard subdivision, take a Butler Farms or something like that, then what you're doing is you're allowing the same amount of development that would otherwise have been allowed across the property onto a smaller amount of the land. This is something that really grew out of Eastern Pennsylvania, really, and a person by the name of Randall Arendt, who was looking for ways in which a municipality could conserve greater amounts of land while still protecting and meeting state regulations in Pennsylvania that were very clearly, assuring property owners the same amount of development. It's a tool that the residential density is based on the underlying density, excluding hazards. The neighborhood is laid out based on the subdivision rules. Typically speaking, a conservation PUD works best when the underlying zoning district is somewhere in the 1 to 2 units an acre density. Once you go a lot above that, what you wind up doing is squeezing a lot of development into a very small area, and then you might find yourself into large building types that may not fit the character of what you're after. So there are two different tools in the toolbox, and to sort of jump into what I know Jessica wants to have as the larger picture conversation is there are two different ways of thinking about growth and development in the city. And as you think about the remaining tracts of land that are unbuilt, what are the city's objectives for those areas? To have a small amount of development and a large area of conservation, or to foster compact neighborhoods. And it doesn't have to be a one size fits all. It can be different areas are appropriate with different tools. So that's my, as quick as I could do it, summary.
So can I ask, when you say one, you can have different kinds of PUDs in, or a limited kind of PUD in particular areas? Is that what you just said?
Yes.
Or we would determine that?
Right. So a simpler, one way to think about it would be, let's say there was an area of the city that was very well served by infrastructure. I'll pick the O'Brien because O'Brien's, under construction right now. That is an area where you might say what we're looking for is a traditional neighborhood. That's the city's objective there. If there were parcels, say along Shelburne Road, something like that. There could be other parts of the city where you might choose to allow a conservation PUD because the objective that you've got in mind is largely conservation oriented. I would say that, not to complicate the conversation, but the Southeast Quadrant is sort of one giant conservation PUD already. That's what the NRP is. And so it's sort of, that's what that is in a really big picture if you consider the entire Southeast Quadrant. So what the discussion here, I think, going forward for you is, in a place like the Southeast Quadrant, do you want to take those areas that have been that are not in the NRP and have them be compact neighborhoods across that entire land? Or are you looking to see ways in which additional conservation could be achieved above and beyond the NRP? And I think that's sort of the fundamental question here. And conceivably, you can do both. The commission has talked about allowing both. The challenge there is, of course, one property owner might decide to say, I want to build it fully, and the one next to them might say, I would like to be conservation. And so from a city design perspective, that would be something to just keep in mind.
Monica?
Yeah, Paul, can you clarify between the two PUDs, the end result in either one may have the same number of units. It's just that in the conservation PUD, they would be more compact.
I guess what I would say, Monica, is that if this written in the best way it can be, they should result in different things. One should be fostering towards a compact neighborhood that is fairly fully built, and the other one should be achieving sort of the amount of neighborhood that the property had at its base reallocated. So we've been trying to not have them overlap too much because the traditional neighborhood provides a lot of opportunity, but it also sets a fairly high bar in terms of design features. And you wouldn't want somebody to do all the compactness, but not have to do any of the design features that make it a quality environment. So that's, we're trying not to have them overlap too much.
But I think the footprint of development would be different between the two, right, Paul? So in the TND, you know, you're setting aside obviously the hazards and the level ones, you know, the things in the environmental protection standards, and then you have the rest of the land, and then you have an additional 15% of that, which becomes the open space or civic space, and then roads and things, and then you have the part that would become kind of the developed piece. Versus,
right. If you had a property with a lot of natural resources on it, then it might start to have the same footprint. So if you had, you know, 60% wetlands on your property, then you probably would wind up with a very similar footprint, and you might choose to your advantage to be a conservation PUD in that case. So that's how that piece is supposed to work for properties that have a lot of natural resources.
Okay, Megan?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Let's start with this one first. So if you are currently, you know, an owner of a parcel that falls under the natural resource protection, right? And so you have TDRs. How does that work with the traditional neighborhood design, traditional neighborhood design and the conservation PUDs?
Great. Thanks for that question. That's a really important question and a really good one. Thank you, Megan. The Southeast Quadrant zoning today sets an assigned density of 1.2 units an acre, and then anything above that average needs to buy TDRs if it's in a district where it's allowed to do that. In a traditional neighborhood, that could remain exactly the same. So you could say that there is no mathematical number as the maximum density as discussed a few minutes ago, but anything above an average of 1.2 units an acre must buy TDRs. And the way that we would deal with that for somebody who chooses not to buy TDRs is that in their master plan, they would determine the small portion of the property that is going to be compactly built, and then another portion of the property could be reserved for future design or development. And so they wouldn't be required to buy TDRs if they didn't want to, but it would be up to a future generation.
So you can now use TDRs on your own property, even if it's natural resource protection? No, natural resource protection is excluded from a traditional neighborhood. It's the only way in which you can use it is to bring in TDRs. Okay, so let's do it now on the housing block. So the new acreage, same scenario. Do those property owners now have TDRs, or there are no new TDRs in the mix here?
As I guess I would say that there are a handful of areas where there's habitat blocks extending beyond the NRP. It's not very many of them. There are a handful, and I guess I'd say that that part of the conversation has not been fully sorted out by the commission yet. It's sort of one of those, you know, as the puzzle pieces have been coming together, that's a puzzle piece still to be placed.
But this does not add new TDRs, just to be clear. We are not currently adding more TDRs.
Thank you. So I got the answer to that question. And we just approved language to be able to move TDRs, so existing TDRs, outside of the Southeast Quadrant along the transit overlay district. And you might have a different name for it. That's how I remember it. Is it the transit overlay or is it something else?
Well, it's similar. It's the urban design overlay, but it's very similar geography.
Thank you. And looking at the map 6, I believe, Jessica, that you showed with the blue the blue areas, the yellow and orange areas, right? The residential versus the industrial commercial. Are there areas in the urban design overlay district, sorry, it's a mouthful, that show that blue, orange, and yellow too? Can we see that map again?
Yeah, I'm going to bring it up. I know I said I would for this part of the discussion.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm somehow no longer a presenter. I don't know how that would have changed. Did Tom leave? And then
No, TH is still there. He's at the top of the screen.
Hang on 1 second, I'll get it for you.
guess my period ended.
Okay, you should be good now.
Yep. Okay, so it's come up. So this is that slide 7. As I said earlier, this will be
Slide
on.
7.
So did you want? I think
Is that how you
this is.
refer to it? Is slide 7? So if I were to write an email to you, I would refer to slide 7?
I suppose so. It does say slide 7 here.
Okay.
And then if I zoom in, so this is Shelburne Road here. You can see there are some red areas along here. There are also areas for infill.
I can't see very clearly. You're showing the southern portion. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I was moving too fast. So this is the northern part of Shelburne Road.
One thing I think is important to note here, the gray that shows built areas is a pretty crude tool. It's just intended to show an amount of land that is not greenfield. I think what we're seeing in the last decade in the city is there is tremendous opportunity for infill development on areas that are built. So for example, last year, the city approved in front of the Holiday Inn on Williston Road, essentially on their parking lot, a additional 5-story building. That's going to show up as gray on this. So I want to make sure that as you think about the gray areas, don't think of them as it's built, there's no room. It's really intended to be, it's not a greenfield area. There is a lot of opportunity for infill development in the city, and we've been slowly seeing it over the last decade.
Yeah. Because I guess my question is, and this is a vision question, and I understand what you are saying, Jessica and Monica, about bringing in jobs and making sure that land uses are compatible with residential use. But I've got to say that those areas along Kimball Avenue in Heinsberg near our technology and our business parks, I don't know what kind of restrictions are on other than our regulations. I don't know who owns the land, all of that I leave to you, but it's my vision. I would ideally, since I've been in those areas and they are not unpleasant areas, I would like us to look along those major transit areas along Route 7 for more industry noise. It's a busy road. It is noisy. We have, what's the former Magic Hat? We have manufacturing plants. I think that in my vision, we want to bring residents close to Tilly Drive, where we have hospital, the UVM Medical Center is there. I see it as a place for, just mixed populations, including employees for Dynapower, for, and I know the name changed, Roland's business, for, REARC and all of those businesses in there. We have an empty building in there. As maybe that's changed, but I can't believe it has changed since COVID. And we also have businesses along Kimball Avenue there. There's the, planned mixed use with commercial, grocery store, all the rest on the New Hill Farm area. I really would like us to think about where housing should go. I am a believer in the use of public transportation. I do not, see that the future is going to get any easier with regard to fossil fuel use and more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And so if we could look to where that mass transit is going to go and really put our residents there, I think it's smart environmentally. I think it meets a need. I've been to the visioning meetings held by CCRPC, and this specifically came up in those meetings. Employees of Roland's company having to drive down from Milton, I think, and I want us to look at our infrastructure, our traffic infrastructure. I cannot imagine adding hundreds, if not thousands, more cars on our roads with this full build out. I would like us to, so that's point one. Point two, I would like us, just like how you said, we have to plan for the future. We might get noisy, kind of ugly, just, in terms of, we all like flowers as opposed to dumpsters, right? Unattractive visuals. So we're thinking that way in the future and what might come, right? We can't say right now what's going to come, but we think to the future what might come. So what I would like to say is that I would like us to do the same step-by-step process for residential. I am all for density when there is transit, when you can get those people on buses instead of having all those cars. And I really would like to leave areas outside of the transit area for the future, for a future planning commission, a future council to say, now it's time for infill. Now we're ready, if we're ready, right? That's for them to decide. I think that there is something to be said for variety, where we look for where density is appropriate and where that it might not be 1.2 homes per acre, it might be 2 homes per acre, it might be, whatever, we can think about it. But I have seen calculations of up to 10 homes per acre, and I am not comfortable with 10 homes per acre throughout our lands where there is no access to that mass transit. And I wanted to put my vision out there. I think that we have to think about the dual goals that this council set out when we agreed to and voted for IZ, which was, let's get these new PUDs out there and let's get these conservation goals so we can meet those, I don't want people to see them as competing. That's why I'm really speaking at length here. I want us to see where these goals overlap. I want to see that we can see incremental changes. We're not planning for 100 years out. That's not our role here. And if we are, then we should be just doing conservation in many more ways than we are. So let us meet those goals, thinking about transit and really fanning out where, as you get further along the fans, you get less and less density. As you get further away from the center, further away from those transit areas, you get less and less density. And as we know, it's a lot more wealth perhaps to have 10 homes per acre, but at the same time, you could have a different style house. You could have perhaps a mixed use. You could have a business where you could have a farm. You could have riding stables. You could do other things that would bring in wealth to those property owners. I don't think that there is one size fits all kind of wealth. Since I have the floor and you're being so patient with me, I have to say that inclusionary zoning is one tool in the toolbox. And I really want to make a plea. There are all kinds of ways to bring affordable housing into fruition. I come from Chicago. I was raised in a very working class neighborhood. And when I was young, I moved into a more middle class neighborhood, but we never were wealthy. And I grew up in an area where there were a lot of Hispanics. And I know the importance of that identity, of living in an area where you have that community. And I wasn't from Chicago, where you have those neighborhood parties. You go into Hispanic neighborhood and, you know, you feel like you're in Mexico. You go into a Polish neighborhood and, you know, you're in a different part of the world. But there is something to be said for people having just kind of ownership of what kind of neighborhood they want to live in. And I understand that PUDs come with. Yep.
Can I just cut in so we have some time for perhaps some other thoughts or big talk? We only have 15 or now we only have 12 minutes left. So I don't mean to cut you off, Megan, but are there other comments?
Thank you for the time. Thank you for the time.
You're welcome. Any thinking?
I have a couple thoughts if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
So my approach is a little different, and that is that this is really valuable work for the city for the amount of remaining open space that's left in the Southeast Quadrant mostly, right? And other connection blocks as well. And it defines for us, I think, those areas that we need to pay particular attention to so that they are preserved, so that there is the least amount of development around them that is balanced with our need for housing and with the desires of the private landowners to develop their land if they are able to. I understand Megan's concerns about, too much transportation, but I just want to say that I have never seen so many hybrid and electric cars on the road as I've seen today, and it's just going to grow. So regardless of whether you think people should be in small units and traveling, or there should be in individual units, right? That more than a third of the carbon dioxide produced by the state is from transportation, right? And a lot of that's from people traveling long distances to get to work. But if you do some comparisons on electric cars versus combustion cars over 10 years, the electric cars far surpass in the amount of CO2 that they don't emit, period, especially in Vermont. So the point there is that a lot of people are going to be driving electric cars in the next 20 years. It may be a higher percentage than you ever believed. And they're still going to want to drive their cars. The question is, how do we conserve the land that we have and have the smartest development on that land that puts the right number of units on the property that's developable, that is a compromise, because not every party is going to be pleased here. The landowner's not going to be pleased because they're not going to get the density they want. The open space people aren't going to get everything they want because there's going to be some housing there, right? And the affordable housing people will be disappointed because they won't get the density that they want as well. These two types, the TND and the conservation PUD, I think is the city's best effort to try and meet all those goals at the same time. And I really support them. If you look closely at some of these maps, there really isn't a lot of big open blocks of property that haven't already been tagged with permits, aren't being scraped for soil right now to put it in streets and homes. There isn't that much left. And I think that's why this is so important for a lot of people from different perspectives here, right? But I just want to point that out. And, I think this will bring new rules in, which will force new developments to obey some really logical and responsible, applications for how they use the property and how they protect those connectors and those streams and the stream buffers and how close that they can get to them. I mean, there are lots of examples in the city where the 50-foot stream buffer or wetland buffer is just not enough. It's not enough. And so 100 foot is a really good idea. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Okay, Ted?
Yeah, one, with regard to housing density and so on, and one issue that I hope that the city council addresses, maybe with the school board, is how many more homes do we build until we need a new school? And keep in mind that trying to get a bond through for a new school can be a little dicey. So I think that's part of the grand plan. It's terrific to say, well, let's have another 12, 15, 2,000 more units. That's terrific. But suddenly are we throwing the dial to a $200 million bond? So I think whether it's planning with the city council, whether it's the school board, I don't know. But here we're planning for density with X number of more people. And am I guaranteeing that I'm suddenly going to pay $3,000 more in taxes because there's a new school? So I think it's something that we all have to really consider.
I think we're going to be having those conversations with the school board, but I think it's a good point. Matt, you have your light on, so I suspect you want to say something?
Yeah, just a clarification, and I apologize if I missed this, Paul and Jessica and the rest of the planning commission, but when a developer looks at a piece of land, and can they choose, essentially is it at their decision to choose a T&D, a traditional neighborhood design, or a conservation PUD? How is that adjudicated, or how does that come before the DRB?
Matt, I think that's sort of part of the reason for this evening's conversation is they are different tools. There are circumstances when an option makes sense all the time. So, you might have an area that is, otherwise pretty ripe for being a traditional neighborhood. It's right along transit, et cetera, but it's 80% wetlands. And so there might be a reason for why that property would be better served as a conservation PUD. Elsewhere in the city, I think that's a discussion that is ongoing of, does the city want to allow that to be a developer's choice, or do you want to choose certain areas for one and certain areas for another? And I think that's a discussion that the commission is currently having, and feel free, commissioners, to elaborate on that.
Or if there would be certain mitigating I'm sorry to interrupt the commissioner. I wanted to answer that question directly, but is there certain mitigating factors which would a owner of a piece of land, a developer, would know that this is this criteria must be met in order to have a traditional neighborhood here? Or I don't know. I'm trying to figure out, because I see the appeal of both, but obviously I don't want a one size fits all. There might be opportunities where it makes more sense to do a traditional neighborhood versus a conservation PUD.
Okay, other, Michael?
Yes, I had a comment about this question of choice. Let us say I have a 15-acre farm which I've grown up on, and I now want to do something with it. But I don't want to be told that I have to build a minimum of X number of houses, or I have to use a T&D. I would like to have a choice to build fewer, maybe in a compact way, fewer, but I'd like to have a choice between a T&D and a conservation PUD. Let's say I'm a conservation-minded kind of guy. So I want my land to be conserved to the extent that I can. I don't want to be told as a landowner how much I can build, and I mean, I have to build a certain minimum, and what kind of development I must build. I'm not sure that we can, in fact, do that to a landowner. I don't happen to be a landowner, yeah. But I think it would be an imposition on a landowner to tell him he's got to do this and he has to do that.
But couldn't that be accomplished by entering into a conservation agreement? We saw this certainly on a property the Ewing property, where the property owner wanted to conserve a certain piece of land, and so they just subdivided it, conserved the piece that they wanted to conserve, and they developed the piece that they want to develop. And you would avoid that situation, I believe.
Well, if the landowner has a choice, that's all I'm suggesting.
And we did talk about that, Michael, because you brought it up about the single subdivision. So that is something that we have talked about, and if there's interest, we'll make sure to keep that in. So I don't know if in the next 3 minutes we're gonna solve this question, but I guess one thing that I just want to kind of throw out there is that there's, I think, a difference between the footprint of development and the number of units here that have been kind of separated in a way that they haven't been in the past. And, because of the way that these TND areas can calculate the number of units, it's really based on the footprint of development and making sure that we're using that land that we're basically giving up to development efficiently. And I think that that's a really important part. I've been trying to keep myself from being hung up on number of units, because I think a lot of people are concerned with what it looks like and what open space we might be losing is kind of a bigger question that's a little bit different with the TND than it has been in the past with our current regulations. So,
Jessica, I'm sorry, there's a question in the chat from Alan Strong for you that I think is important. It says, I'm curious what you think about the loss of protection for riparian connectivity, slide 9 of presentation number 2. A lot of the new environmental protections are designed to protect water resources, but it looks like we lose riparian connectivity in the Southeast Quadrant. Will this further challenge our water quality issues? Have you?
Yeah, and this is a good question. It gets back to the data sources. So that riparian connectivity was kind of loosely pointed to in the Southeast Quadrant, and there are a few areas where that particular mapping doesn't overlay with the more kind of South Burlington specific, land specific definitions that are protecting our water resources. So what we're doing is we're looking at every location where there is a water resource, whether that's a stream all the way down to intermittent streams, as well as the wetlands, and buffering them, and even buffering them kind of in a wider way than before. And in fact, we've talked to the state wetland scientists, and they say that there's been no other communities in the state that have as large of buffers as we're proposing here. So we're kind of going beyond what we have in the past, the standard for the state, and what other communities have done in the past. And then what we've also done is, instead of using that kind of fuzzy kind of state level data that's used for that riparian connectivity layer, we did the more specific analysis to figure out where there was actual habitat in primarily forested areas, and we've chosen to conserve or propose those for protection specifically. So although it's not the exact same layer, we have our habitat areas that kind of balloon out with the connections in between. So I think we're going beyond the standard, beyond what we've done in the past, and being really specific to where the best habitat is. And that's based on guidance that we've, that's actually included in the document that riparian connectivity data layer comes with, and the kind of author of that document, Jens Helke. So I know that there's not exact agreement in that the map is different, but I do believe that our data is better in that it's specific to our city and specific to our land features.
Okay, we're at 7:01. I guess I would just say that I have some concerns with your some of the aspects of what you're recommending. And I'm puzzled, I think, like Matt suggested. So which type of PUD do you get to pick? And what will it look like? That's certainly a big question for me. I'll have to really consider and think about the restricted infrastructure encroachment criteria, because I'm sort of puzzled when you have an area of natural resource value that you can build a road across it to get to, quote, the other side. But it sounds like you have a lot of issues that people would have to address, and we'll have to hold our DRB accountable to make sure that those questions are answered and considered before we start sort of, I mean, why have a natural resource area if you can just request a connectivity and build a road through it? But I think you've also done some really, really good work. So that's my part. I don't know if Tom Chittenden wants to put in his 2 cents, but he doesn't have to. And we're at the end of the day, and this isn't the last time we get to eat this apple, right?
It is not. Oh, go ahead, Tom. I know she called on you.
I was just gonna say, I'm broke. I got nothing to add, so, and I have to run. Cheers.
All right, that's fine.
So Han, our planning commission is going to stay on, and we have an agenda item to potentially warn this for public hearing. So I don't know if the city council has a preference on if we warn this for public hearing and go through the process to kind of get this wrapped up and to you to adopt first, or if you would specifically prefer if we do our kind of more informal public comment period and wait to kind of advance it to you until we have the PUD work completed as well. So I know you had an initial discussion with this before, but
right.
If you
Well,
want
I personally would prefer the latter, that you have your semi-public listening and then decide as a commission if there's any adjustments or changes you want to make, and then send it to us. I don't think we're talking about a terribly long time frame to do that. But I'm just one person on the council. So if other people.
That makes sense, Councilor. That makes sense to me as well.
Yep, I would go on with that.
And I want to make sure I understood that correctly. So warn for public hearing, complete the draft and get it to you for possible adoption. Was that, or did I mix it up?
No, you had suggested you were having a public hearing, not a hearing, a listening. And so the public didn't get all that much chance tonight to comment. So I'd like to give them that chance. And then if there are issues that you feel either the council has raised or they have raised that you want to work on, you can, and then warn for a public hearing for that final draft. Does that make sense?
I guess my bigger question is, do you want us to wait to give you anything until we have all the PUD work dwe or not? Or would you like
I'm okay with getting your final draft before we get a final draft of the PUDs. But that's me. I don't know how anyone else thinks, because we haven't had that discussion totally.
Okay.
So I think we've left the question unanswered, right, Jessica? Which is, do we designate certain areas as conservation PUDs or certain areas as TNDs, or do we leave it up to the will of the property owner working with staff and the DRB to determine that?
Correct.
If it's the latter,
and that
I'm fine with it. There's no more work to do.
Yeah, and that particular question is really included in the PUD work. I'm really talking about specific to the environmental protection standards, and if we should advance them to you ahead of completing the PUD work. I'm sorry, I maybe wasn't clear on what I was asking.
That's my preference.
Yeah, that's, I
understand
think
that
what we had
question.
said at our council meeting, right? To
Yeah.
put a pin in it, right? Just to relieve you of, that's no longer an open question, right?
Okay.
So you can focus.
So advanced environmental protection standards first, put the pin in it, as Megan just said, and then continue to work on the PUD standards to get that to you as a second package. Okay.
Correct.
Sorry, I was confusing on that. I know there's a lot
Well,
here.
I probably,
As a follow-up though to Matt's comment, I'm sorry, to Matt's point though, we do need that clarity from the city council, which clearly won't come tonight because we're past time and you guys need to talk about it. But that kind of direction is what we really need from you. Do you want to limit a certain part of the city to only be a conservation PUD? Do you not, like, your perspective on that would be very helpful. And so maybe if you guys add that to an agenda, future meeting to discuss that kind of specific, it would be very helpful to us.
okay,
Good idea. Great idea.
good idea.
That makes sense. That makes
I can
sense.
tell you what I
Okay.
want right now.
Understood what Helen said is that the commission will do the informal listening sessions based on the draft that we will have of the environmental protection standards, and then move on. Once we've made whatever necessary changes, I'll move on to do a public hearing.
Yes.
Dr.
Okay.
Blood said, haha, no worries. Yeah, once you turn
Helen, do we need
notifications
to
on,
do
you
that
can mute
separate?
individual
Because
servers
I'd
by
really like to make
right-clicking
sure
them
the
if
public
that gets
has one
annoying.
particular draft that they have for many, many weeks that all the comments are on. I'm afraid that if we do another, because we've already had one draft for a long time with some edits, and I think if we change it too often, it's very difficult for people to get their minds around all of it.
So is your listening meeting?
The listening
a
session
hearing,
is,
or I guess the listening session, I was confused, maybe what you were.
so
using
the
that
listening
for.
session is to during our, with this particular draft, just to be able, I mean, I know there's a lot of questions in the comments here, and I just
Dr.
really
Blood
want the
said
chance for the public to have a
drive.google.com.
bigger discussion before the pressure's on with a public hearing.
Dr. Blood
So
said, does
we
this
didn't
link
want to go
work?
straight to the last second, but I wanted to make sure there was question answering period of time, kind of as part of the review of this particular draft.
Right, so I guess the way to maybe to think about it is the state law sets a minimum for one public hearing. There's nothing that stops a body from having multiple input sessions leading up to the public hearing to give. So when the form-based code was adopted, I think the commission had 3 of them during the period leading up to the public hearing, so that people could come at a time that was convenient to them and make sure that there's plenty of opportunity for folks to weigh in.
Yeah, we're in the home stretch now. Let's not stumble at the last minute. Let's make sure everybody has a chance to,
Okay.
the public has a chance to have their say.
Okay, and you're getting some good feedback from the public about having that listening session, and UVM also has a letter that they sent to you and me, Jessica. I didn't see it till the middle of the meeting.
I actually didn't see it yet.
Yeah, so they can certainly come to the listening. They have their letter and they can come to the listening.
And we do
session.
also accept written or emailed comment as well, and read those carefully.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It was, it may not seem like it was helpful, but it was.
So just so everyone knows, the planning commission is staying on after the council leaves. I just want to make sure we don't lose people who wanted to stay on. So the planning commission is still going to meet after Helen closes the council meeting.
Okay, so I will adjourn this joint meeting a few minutes late. Thank you all for giving up another. Oh, are you waiting to say something, Megan?
Just a big thank you. A lot of work. Thank you.
Okay, so
It's
the
looking good.
council will leave you. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully that was a lot to organize. I hope I didn't misrepresent our work. I know
Oh, it's great, Jess.
Great. Okay, so we are going to start the Planning Commission meeting. We have on our agenda a little debrief. I mean, does anyone have any follow-up on that specifically? I know we're embarking on a big public input session here, so.
You know, I think what might be really helpful is if we do a follow-up meeting to the city council and just make a list of, like, we talked about the one saying, you know, gee, if you guys could have an agenda item where you specifically talk about, do you want each PUD type everywhere or not, period? Are there any other like big questions that we didn't get to that are very clear now that they have that very clear background? What other big picture pieces? Because we may not have Paul for a while, so.
Yeah, and as we were moving through that discussion, I was feeling like that if everyone agrees, I'll reach back out to Helen and just say that we would be willing to do another joint meeting to get into more of that discussion and get some more feedback from them. Does that seem like a good idea? Would we be willing to kind of spend that time?
Well, I mean, can they meet on the issue and then, you know, give us our marching orders?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we have a lot on our plate still, and I just hate to get meted out.
Yeah. No, it's a good point, Ted. I agree. So maybe that's a good approach. We can have them do a follow-up discussion, and if they're ready to do some more discussion, we could maybe at that point entertain a second joint meeting. Does that?
Yeah, and if they do add it to their agenda, we could know about it and try to be there and not, I mean, only to, if a few of us, if all of us, whatever, could also just be in the audience so that if there's confusion, we can play the role simply of clarifying, not pitching or abdicating or whatever, but just keep helping them be as productive as possible.
That sounds good. Any other specifics? I mean, that seems like a good approach with the council.
You know, I just want to follow up, you know, about with regard to the housing and in the schools. I really think I'm still confused if we're planning, but, you know, are we planning for an inevitable bond vote? You know, so I just hope the city council is privy and the school board is what the heck we're doing. You know, we're looking at this, but we can't look at it in just from a small view. You know, it has to be this major view of all the implications that we're doing, you know, whether it's the environmental part or the fact that are we en route to a new school based on whatever things that we do. So just as an aside, I know it's not on our agenda for sure.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? And maybe if this is something Paul can help clarify or anybody else, to that point, when you were saying that, Ted, I was asking myself, well, how is that planning different from our current regs right now? You know, it's really not. Our current regs right now would, if built out, would result in potentially that happening as well. So the PUDs, the environmental that stuff isn't. It's if everything is built out according to our current LDRs, it would also result potentially in something like that happening. So I guess it's just to keep the focus on where is there a difference from our LDRs versus not, you know, or do they want a change?
Right. Well, I don't want to debate, but my issue isn't the fact that the PUDs are going to create anything, but the fact is that the public should be aware, you know, what we're doing, whether it's TDRs or whatever, is that there is eventually probably going to have to be a school, and that probably should be dialed in for people to know this. That's all. And I'm not saying that there's going to be more with PUD or less. And you're right, it may very well be the same. But I think that's sort of a planning issue.
I wish Duncan were here tonight. He had been on the school committee when they looked at the future build out and the need for future schools. And Monica, were you on And Paul, and also it sounds like we maybe have some information on that. I don't know if one of you wants to weigh in, or Michael has his hand up. Is it about the schools, Michael, or do we?
Well, yes, it's about their ways to manage the issue so that it doesn't creep up on you, as Ted has mentioned, and all of a sudden, oh my God, we need a new school because we're out of. A lot of towns and cities have what are called a development management cap. In other words, they only do a certain number of permits per year so that they can manage the among others, can manage the infrastructure things, the infrastructure that they have to provide, and not be overwhelmed in a year. So that they have a fairly organized plan. We're going to do X number per year, and that's planning. I mean, that's good planning, because they don't end up with surprises. They know what's coming every year. So it's something we might talk about at some point. I don't know if it fits in with what we're doing now, but it's something we should bear in mind.
Okay. Any other follow-up from the joint meeting, or do you want to kind of talk about the potential kind of warning for public hearing?
Well, is the only additional piece of clarification we need from them the PUD choice everywhere or limited, or are there any other big questions? Like, there were questions going back to the discrepancies with the level 2 map in the plan, in the comp plan. You pointed out very clearly what our work has done, and it shows what we left off of those level 2s. I mean, that's the path we're going. If the city council has a strong opinion about that, we should know that soon, because that will have a big impact. So that might be, and if they don't answer it, then we'll continue going down our path and get public comment, right? But that might be helpful.
Yeah, Paul, did you want to?
Yeah, I guess I'd just say that, to me, to a certain extent, those are the same question. In terms of what do you want to see or what does the council want to see? What do you want to see in the unbuilt areas? If it's a conservation PUD, then you would, if a property did not have a lot of natural resources on it, you would build up with additional ones prioritized by you that might be those things that are on map 8. If it's going to be a traditional neighborhood, then you might want to say that you want to see those areas become future neighborhoods. So to a certain extent, it's the same big question. There's different tools, but it's the same big question, in my view, at least, of what's the city looking for in these unbuilt areas.
Maybe just to be really helpful to the council then is to take just a few of those images, the one comp plan overlay map that was very clarifying, and maybe a picture of a conservation PUD and a picture of a TND, and just give them those 3 visuals and then summarize exactly that issue. And that would probably take up a good chunk of debate and agenda in itself.
So essentially, I think that's what we just did do. We put that all in front of them and asked the question, and they know that it hasn't been answered yet. So I think that's what Helen was saying, that they're going to do the follow-up discussion. I will follow up with Helen and see if she feels like she needs any additional materials. I'll find out when they're going to do that meeting, and I'll, attend if I can. I'll let people know if I can't attend, to make sure someone from the commission is there in case they have questions, and kind of remind her of the question. Okay, then, so next on our agenda is the review and possible action to approve advancing LDR 20-01, the draft that we've been discussing, and the accompanying planning commission report, which was in the joint meeting packet. So I think we got pretty clear direction that they were interested in us kind of moving forward with this as a separate package to them. So So I think that does make sense for us to move forward with the public hearing. Like at our last meeting, we talked about kind of not setting a public hearing in the case where they didn't want us to kind of advance it separate.
Mhm.
So I guess we would, in order to do that, make a motion to warn the environmental protection standards and the accompanying report for public hearing, and we would choose a date for that. And I see that public hearing as kind of a like an end date, where we would have all of the informal listening sessions and question answering kind of leading up to that. And then, you know, at that point, we'll have all of that input kind of on this particular draft, and we'll be able to really talk through that and make changes, you know, and, you know, kind of have that discussion on what things we want to change at that point. Paul?
And just to note that as part of your public hearing notice, you can certainly let people know about the listening session leading up to it. They don't have to be different things. Think of it as being a public hearing with multiple sessions to it. And then just a reminder that after the public hearing, you are authorized to make any changes that you so choose to based on the feedback that you've been given. You're not locked into a set of regulations. So you can certainly do that. So,
Paul, Paul, in terms of your timing, I'm just so concerned about your timing. Is June 1st? Is that's after your time, but before your next time, right? I don't care what the date is, but is that you had a spring?
yeah, I anticipate being out about 3 weeks from when the kid comes around, which will happen sometime in the next couple weeks. So, you know, outermost 5 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm.
So
and then you were gone again in August, or I'm sorry, just
July.
July. Okay, so I potentially June 1st, if anybody likes that timing.
So you have a meeting scheduled for the 11th of May and the 25th of May. So those would be your two regular meeting dates. You could choose to have it on one of those if you wanted.
I think I was originally thinking kind of mid-May, you know, which would give a little over a month, and then we'd have time to really delve into the comments as a group. So maybe that May 11th.
Jessica, we have the listening session first at one meeting, and then at the next meeting, we warn a public hearing.
I'm proposing to warn the public hearing tonight, and between now and the public hearing, we'll have the listening session and potentially other listening sessions as well, to make sure there's multiple times when people could be coming and asking questions and giving feedback, and all the comments would all be kind of considered as part of the input. Not only
okay, as long as now that answers my listening sessions will happen before the public hearing.
Yes, I wanted to make sure that there was, you know, I think it's hard for people to formulate questions until they see everything. So I wanted to make sure that we were available for a big chunk of time in a less formal situation, to really be able to talk through things and answer questions, and not have it be just one public hearing. But I did picture that I mean, we've already gotten some comments, and that any comments that we got during the listening session or by email in the whole period, as well as at the actual hearing, would all be considered input on that we would be considering all together as part of it.
So you want to second your motion, Monica?
Oh, is that sure? Was that a motion? Yes,
Could
June
you
1st.
repeat it?
So I'm gone June 1st, just in the 25th. So that's my 2 weeks of vacation. So when I would like to be here, because I'd really like to hear all of the public input. So I guess that's why I was thinking the 11th, you know, kind of before I was away for vacation. But
May 11th for the listening session or the hearing?
hearing, because we've already posted on our website the listening sessions April 27th.
But Paul most likely won't be here. Doesn't it seem like?
If you wanted me there, the 18th would be a good day. I know that's an off meeting day for you, but you could do that.
We can
And then
the 18th. And then that would give us maybe an additional time to do an additional listening session in there potentially as well. You know,
And if we do it as early as the 5/18, right? No, I'm sorry, now I'm losing track. 5/18? So if we were to do it on 5/18 and we had a few listening sessions, Paul, and then we had questions about some things and wanted to make changes, though, it seems like we want to have time with the planning staff to make any potential edits before we, right? Because even if if we release this package now, do we have to have that same package for the hearing, or can we make any evolution? Same package.
So you can be discussing changes that you would want to make, but you're warning a hearing on the set that is now. And I think, I understand it's sort of a catch-22, because on the one hand, you want to be able to make changes. On the other hand, as Jessica said, letting people know this is the draft to comment on, so they're not sort of chasing rabbits around the yard, trying to figure out which one is the last one that they're looking at. I think that's the challenge.
Okay, well, I'll make a motion that we warn the meeting for May 18th.
Second.
okay. Is that worded well enough, Paul? I know it was some.
Yes, as long as you're also approving the report that would go with it. You can always change the report afterwards if you find later that you want to modify it.
How do I refer to the package?
I think just the accompanying planning commission report.
The public meeting on the accompanying public commission planning commission report for May 11th.
I do. Wouldn't it really? Isn't the question really advancing for a public hearing? The report. We're not really voting on the full report right now, are we?
No, it's true. I think we might need to nix this motion and start over and use the word hearing in the report if I
don't like making motions. I'll second somebody else's.
So, well, I would say that we would just, I would move that we advance the draft environmental protection standards for a public hearing for May 18th.
I'll second that.
Okay, so any discussion on the motion, or was that Paul?
I understand the distinction that Ted is making about not necessarily approving the report, but the state law does require that a report accompany the draft. So you could say and advance the report at this time also, something like that. But it is required under state law that a report go with the draft.
And is the report the draft memo that is in the package that we've looked at? I thought we approved that in the last meeting.
We did, but we have to specifically include it in the motion to go with the draft language. It's just that they have to go together.
And I don't think we have a question about that, right, Ted?
Well, I mean, there's still issues within the report that I have. And so I'm not willing to say, okay, blanket, I'm absolutely going to unequivocally without any changes pass this report as it stands now, until I would make the vote and at the end probably advance it, but there's still. So that's
no, that makes sense, Ted. So I think what you're saying is you want to have the public input and then really talk through that and have the ability to make changes before anything goes to city council, and that is the process. So I think, although your word said, so yes, that is how it works. But we want to put something in front of the public for comment.
Mhm.
And then we would be able to, before it goes to city council, make edits.
Yeah,
And
yeah, possibly, just have
So
that
you-
up.
Right, so you do need to approve a report to go with the hearing, but you can change, that does not lock you into future changes.
Okay,
If you're uncomfortable with the report, then I guess I'd say, that should either be modified or not hold a public hearing, because the law does say shall prepare and approve a written report on the proposal. So
no, I wish to not, well, I wish to advance it, so I'm, whatever wording you just said, sorry, that approving the report.
Well, you said it must have a written report. You didn't say it has to have an approved report.
the state law says when considering an amendment to the bylaw, the planning commission shall prepare and approve a written report on the proposal.
But we did in the last meeting approve the report for this phase. We approved this report and these draft LDRs to go forward to the public, knowing that after the hearing, we may have changes, but the report and the draft LDRs have been approved for us for this stage to move to the public. And I think the motion is to then move that approved
I
report,
don't remember.
LDRs.
I don't remember the motion in our last meeting to do what you just said. I'm not unhappy with advancing. I don't think we had a motion to approve the draft at our last meeting.
It was like 2 meetings ago. We had a motion to proceed with the LDRs as they were written. And then you had the counter, Michael, that was no because of the 9, and then so that definitely happened.
I guess not to mince words, but I agree with what Monica said, but that was not a formal approval of the warning for a public hearing or the report. It was a statement of intent, but not the vote.
Okay.
We wanted to wait for the direction with council on kind of their expectations first. So, is Ted's motion as worded acceptable to do what we want to do to warn a public hearing, Paul?
And accept the report. That's what you wanted to have added to it, right, Paul?
Yes, so I think reading the state law, it's approved the report, but if you're comfortable in saying warn the draft for public hearing and approve a report with the understanding that both may be modified following the public hearing, that would be great.
Yeah, that's fine. That's what the motion is.
Okay, was that seconded?
I seconded it.
Okay. Any discussion on the motion?
Did we want to add dates within that right now for the listening sessions, or do we want to?
Why don't you just approve the hearing itself as a motion, and then if you want to talk about dates supplemental, go for it.
Okay.
Okay, any discussion or comments on the motion? Okay, all in favor of advancing? Aye. Okay, any opposed? So it's 4. Any opposed?
I'm abstaining for now. I think we're rushing, but that's just my personal view. I'm struggling with some of this. So I'm abstaining on this one.
Okay, very good. So motion passes with 4 and 1 abstention. Thank you. So Monica, you wanted to talk about some additional listening sessions. We have one set for April 27, which is shown on the website. And Monica, your idea of having a separate website for this project was really good. And Paul, it's great. It looks really nice. And
that looks fantastic. Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, is there a way? I mean, I'm happy to participate in as many listening sessions as people want.
One thing that we've done when it's kind of a really big thing is to try to schedule one at a different time. So, April 27th is during our regular Tuesday evening meeting. And then, our public hearing, the official public hearing on the 18th is going to be during our official kind of Tuesday evening slot. I'm wondering if we want to do one that's more of a kind of a lunchtime time frame, just for people who the evening, a Tuesday evening may not work for. Maybe on one of those.
I think that would be wise because apart from anything else, I'm not sure how much we can get through at each listening session. So having more than one and having them at different times is a great idea. You get possibly more participation that way.
Okay, I think that sounds like a great idea. Should we try
In the
to
past, you've also not necessarily tried to have all commissioners attending each one. Also, you can have a smaller number and have notes that are shared with everyone else. Now we can even record it. So.
Okay, so maybe a lunchtime, either the first or second week of May, maybe that first week of May. And then we can try to have as many commissioners as available. I know some aren't available for work reasons. So, you know, if we weren't all able to attend, others could listen later. Michael?
Yeah, maybe Paul just answered it. Somebody asked when and how will the public get access to the draft regulations? And Paul has already answered that.
Great. So that is on the website, as well as the first listening session is announced on there, and then any others we're kind of talking about are going to get added to that website as well as an announcement.
There's one question in the chat about, do we need different types of listening sessions for different groups of people? This Chris Trombley's question pertains to like different neighborhoods. But I don't, well, so neighborhoods, are there other different types? I don't know that there are. And I had a question actually, Paul, is it possible to do a session in person? We still can't do that, right?
At this time, I would say no.
You know, Monica, I actually, so we had gotten, one of the public comments I saw came in was requesting that. I don't know. I think I did forward that to everyone. But so I asked Paul to look into kind of how our meeting attendance has been. So we've had 20 meetings since August when we restarted. And in that time period, so he did a comparison to the 20 meetings prior to COVID. And our attendance has actually been up between 15 and 20% above the average public attendance at our meetings. So we are actually including 15 to 20% more public members in our meetings in this format. And I'm not saying that it works for everyone, but this format, we are actually hearing more voices, or at least they're hearing us. So.
Yeah. I would venture a guess that it's going to be the same people who've been following this through, or a large percentage of the people will be at these listening sessions. I would hope that that's not the case, but I think that's the reality. Unless people out there really are conscious of the different changes that we're making. And that's the big question is, are we able to, we can't give them this 50-page document and have them go through it. They have to be aware of the bullet points of what changes that might impact their neighborhoods. So I still would guess that it's the groupies that, people are watching this carefully and very few new people.
I'm not sure that we need different listening sessions for different populations. Like I do feel that, we really want these to be applicable to the whole city. I know sometimes we do things that are really targeted to a particular area of the city. So does it sound like a listening session on the Tuesday night in April 27th, and then a kind of lunchtime first week of May, one day that week, maybe making sure we're not overlapping with a different committee, and then our official hearing on the 18th. And Does that seem like a reasonable schedule? And then plus written, I mean, we've already been receiving some emailed comments as well. So I think we'll obviously continue to take those and read them.
And Jessica, can you define for us and for the public exactly what we mean by a listening session? Like, is it a place where people can go to ask us questions so that they can then articulate their comments at the hearing committee? Or are we to be listening to their comments in these meetings as if, and then report back to everybody as if it is a comment during a hearing? Like what?
Yeah, I think it's both. I want to make sure that we're available to answer questions because I do think there are questions. And then, you know, so that was why I thought a more informal listening session, but I don't think we want to just be talking at the people and presenting and only answering questions. I do see any comments that we hear during those listening sessions being part of our official listing of comments that we're getting during the period, and sharing them. And that's why I do think that both of these listening sessions should be an official planning commission meeting with as many commissioners in attendance as can. You know, knowing that the noon one or, you know, a lunchtime one that we may not all be able to because of work. So it may not be all 7 of us, but I do see them being able to take in official comment as well as answering questions, because I think we owe that to the public.
Okay.
Anything else or any other items? Our meeting next week is on. Go ahead, Michael.
Do you have an idea how such a public listening session might be managed? You know, who speaks when, and obviously somebody has to be a moderator, which in most cases it's you. Are you going to watch for people to hold up their hands? How do you plan to manage if there's a lot of people there? Well, you know, maybe 10 altogether, maybe a few more.
Yeah, it's actually a really good question, Michael. And I think we could choose how we do that as a group. I mean, one thing would be to, similar to what I have been doing, you know, looking for people to raise their hands and or put something in the chat that then we can kind of go down the chat in order. Does that? It's a good question. We haven't done something like this in this format, but we have been managing questions and comments during meetings.
Yeah, no, maybe using the chat in the order in which the questions are being posed would be a good idea. It's just that I know that it's very difficult to hold that kind of session virtually. You know, it's difficult enough to do it in person, but it's very difficult to do it virtually.
I do agree. And, you know, as you know, I was resistant to going back to meeting in this format. I actually really was hoping that we could somehow hold off till COVID was over and we could meet in person, which obviously didn't happen, which is why we started meeting again in August. But I guess what I've come to realize is that ideally in a well-organized meeting, there's only one person talking at each time, and there's kind of a queue of people who are lined up to say something in an orderly fashion. So like, it kind of seems like maybe this is working okay. Like, we really shouldn't be talking over each other anyway. So I don't know what your perspective is, and if you feel like if we're missing a lot. I do think we missed some visual cues, and maybe if somebody is really trying to respond, but it seems like it's been working pretty well. Paul?
Jessica, one thought for the listening session is the chat is a really useful tool, but one advantage of sort of the in-person meetings and the visual is that you make sure that you're hearing from each person who wants to speak. One challenge with the chat is that it can sort of insert itself in between, and so you might want to say, you know, we'd like to make sure that we've heard from each different person who wants to say something, whether it's something short or something long. If you put something in the chat, I may not come back to you. If you put multiple things in the chat, I'll prioritize hearing somebody first for the first time, just to make sure that everybody gets a chance to weigh in. It's a new format. We'll have to figure it out, but I just want to make sure that, you know.
Yeah, it is. I've seen, and Michael's here, and I'm sorry, I was not looking. But one thing I have noticed is that there are some people who do use the chat as an actual chat, like a respond to a lot of different things. And I think you're right that may be hard to manage, because it can wind up more like a conversation. Michael?
Yeah, and the chat has its advantages, but it has a lot of disadvantages, particularly for people like me who speak a lot quicker than they can type. And I think it may be a disincentive for people to speak up if they have to type something rather than just put up your hand and speak. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe not using the chat. I mean, what Paul just said is actually a really good point. I mean, maybe it really should be verbally listening to one person at a time in the order we see their hands come up, and then maybe the chat, because it can be used as a sidebar conversation, maybe we discourage that being used. I'm just trying to brainstorm.
I think that's better. Yeah, I think that's better, to see people's hands, and then they can switch on their camera and we can see their body language and all the rest of it.
Does that seem like it makes sense to Paul Ingalls?
Yeah.
My body language is telling me it's hungry.
I know, me too.
I have a little secret to tell you all about this. I actually have a Master of Science degree in this kind of stuff, public telecommunications planning. And I've had that degree for, I think, 43 years. And when I was in graduate school, we talked about replacing transportation with communication. And this is the first, the pandemic has been the impetus for that actually happening after all these years. So I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic is this kind of stuff. And I think we'll see lots more of it, probably driven by global warming, you know, the necessity to really eliminate transportation as much as we can and replace it with communication, which is what we're doing right here.
Well,
I'm all for it.
It's pretty neat. I'm actually joining you from Pennsylvania tonight, which I'm so excited.
I'm thinking that too. If we go on vacation this summer, we can still go to meetings. It's fine. You know?
Yeah.
I actually, to that point, the survey that they're doing for the Swift Spear, that presentation was so excellent, and I'm wondering if there isn't somebody who could help us create an interactive way for the public to provide comment in a way that's easy for us to digest, some kind of survey like that. Maybe whoever created the survey for the Swift Spear, it could be a really good model. And without it getting too complicated, but it might be a really good way. We can look at 1,000 emails, but if there's some kind of easy way for the community to give us information and then for us to output it in a way that's organized, that could be very, very helpful.
Yeah, and the questions obviously are critical. They can't be rhetorical.
I think I wouldn't deny chat to people. I think people now have an expectation that it's going to be there, and there are some active participants, so why discourage them, you know?
Yeah.
It's just another facet.
Yeah. Well, you did a great job, Jessica.
Yeah, it was a good meeting tonight, yeah.
Oh, I'm all worked up over it.
Are we dismissed?
Yes, thank you so much. You are dismissed. Adjourned.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, everyone.
Good luck in the future.
Oh.
Good night.